Thank you for accessing Vocabulary Module 2, Direct Instruction. This module is the second of 3 in a vocabulary tutorial series developed for the Teacher Collaboration Project between Rio Rancho Public Schools and the Southwest English Learners Partnership, a partnership within the Regional Educational Laboratory, or REL Southwest, a part of the National Center of Educational Evaluation and Regional Assistance within the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. If this is not the first module that you've viewed in this tutorial, you can scrub ahead in the recording until you see a slide with a large purple star in the upper right-hand corner, which signals the start of new content. The content up until that slide is common to all 3 modules. The focus of this tutorial and the focus of our partnership as a whole is on supporting EL students' achievement. And for that, we look to the kinds of practices in instruction that are best supported by rigorous research. The latest Works Clearinghouse EL-focused practice guide, which was published in 2014, endorses academic vocabulary instruction as a very promising and strongly supported practice that comes from research and that we know works for cultivating EL's content knowledge and literacy skills. Together, there are 2 recommendations that are presented in this practice guide that are supported by strong evidence. And those recommendations emphasize 2 things. 1, integrating a variety of academic vocabulary instructional activities, and 2, doing so into content area teaching. So you can see the recommendations as articulated in that practice guide here focus on 1, teaching a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities, and 2, integrating oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. These may seem simple, but there's a lot packed into these 2 recommendations. The Works Clearinghouse practice guides break their recommendations down into concrete implementation steps that you can actually bring to bear in your instruction. Each of our 2 recommendations that are the focus of this vocabulary tutorial include 4 concrete implementation steps that we'll go into different levels of detail on as we progress through the different tutorial modules. For recommendation 1, which reads, teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities, we have a focus on choosing a brief, engaging piece of informational text that includes academic vocabulary, choosing a small set of academic vocabulary for in-depth instruction, teaching academic vocabulary in depth using multiple modalities, including writing, speaking, and listening, and teaching word learning strategies to help students independently figure out the meaning of words. Those 4 implementation steps will give us the overarching structure of our 3 vocabulary tutorial modules, as I'll discuss on the next slide. But I wanted to draw your attention to the way that recommendation 2 is also spelled out in 4 implementation steps, which will be infused throughout the instruction that we offer here. The first implementation step for recommendation 2, which again is about integrating oral and written language instruction into content area teaching, talks about strategically using instructional tools like videos, visuals, and graphic organizers to anchor instruction and help students make sense of content, explicitly teaching the content-specific academic vocabulary as well as general academic vocabulary that supports it during content area instruction. The third implementation step talks about providing daily opportunities for students to talk about content in pairs or small groups. So this is oral language practice emphasis. And then provide writing opportunities to extend student learning and understanding of the content material. So as just mentioned, the 4 implementation steps that are contained in this recommendation 1 give us the structure of the 3 modules for this vocabulary tutorial. And we can extract from those 4 implementation steps these 3 different focuses that we'll go into in some depth over the course of the 3 modules. The first is about selecting text and target words, both selection activities that have some similar characteristics. The second is providing in-depth multimodal instruction. And the third is teaching word learning strategies. You can also watch a member of the panel that put together the What Works Clearinghouse practice guide and see her describe recommendation 1 on YouTube, which is linked here, but there's also a clickable link on our resources website. So this module focuses on that second high leverage approach to teaching academic vocabulary and supporting EL's content learning, which says here, teach academic vocabulary in depth using multiple modalities, writing, speaking, and listening. And that's what we'll focus on today. So direct instruction across modalities can be really critical. The goal of instruction is for students to understand how a word is typically used, and that can be an understanding that goes well beyond memorizing definitions or learning about word meanings in a shallow way. And this can be achieved by providing students opportunities to experience new vocabulary in multiple ways, making them an integral part of students' listening, speaking, reading, and writing activities, supporting students' familiarity with new words and drawing attention to those words and how they can be used in different contexts with different interlocutors in different kinds of conversations and in writing and in speech can really foster and solidify students' understanding and facility with using new words. So we want to draw attention to a distinction between dictionary definitions, which is something that we often provide when we're giving students vocabulary for the purpose of teaching them vocabulary, and usable word knowledge of the kind that we would want to embed in content instruction when we want to support EL's vocabulary mastery as they're trying to work through this content as well. So with a somewhat complex word like vociferous, you might see a definition that says crying out noisily. That might be what comes from the dictionary. But that phrase on its own could be interpreted in a lot of different ways and possibly misinterpreted, because being vociferous isn't the same as shrieking, but that's one way you could understand what it means to cry out. On the other hand, if you give this example sentence, people who are vociferous speak with determination because they want their views and beliefs to be heard. That gives a clear and immediate picture in the listener's mind of what it is that a vociferous person does. You also understand that it's an adjective that describes people, probably typically describes people, that has this characteristic of being a determined thing, and that also involves views and beliefs as opposed to just doing something loudly. There's a different kind of content and shading to this word that usable sentences that provide examples like these can really be helpful in understanding and conveying. So how do we bring these usable definitions and understandings of words to life for students? Well, we want to give them opportunities to encounter those words in multimodal contexts, so all different kinds of writing, listening, reading, speaking activities, and focusing their attention on these new words because they're high leverage for the content that you're working on teaching. So how do we help students gain that deeper understanding of target words? That What Works Clearinghouse practice guide suggests that there are 6 different steps we can take to make sure that students are developing that deep understanding. We'll go from left to right. Provide student-friendly definitions of the target words and apply them to the context of the text. Clarify and reinforce definitions using examples, non-examples, and concrete representations. Provide opportunities for students to respond to questions where they show their understanding using subtle differences in usage and meaning. Facilitate structured discussions to increase opportunities for students to talk about academic words. That's really bringing in this multimodal piece. Require students to use the target academic words in their writing activities, another modality of language use, and engage students in activities that will increase their exposure to and experiences with the new words. So let's dig into each of those tips. The first is give student-friendly definitions. We're going to make reference to the same text that we spent a lot of time discussing and digging into in the first module, in this module as well. So as you see on the right, there's a text about walking into a zoo, noticing that the exhibits look different from how they used to. And the basic lesson of this text is that the environments that animals had lived in zoos back in the day, in the 60s and up until much more recently, animals were more confined in their zoo environments, and now they have more natural habitats that are like the environments that they would encounter and live in nature. So in this text, we have these key words. Say we selected exhibit as one of our target words for instruction. What we want to do here is provide digestible target word definitions that are anchored in that target text. So here you would define exhibit potentially as a show or display that is meant for a lot of people to see. And that's not the only thing that exhibit can mean, but because we're anchoring that definition in the text, that's the one that we're going to focus on. And we want to then draw students' attention to the locations in the text where the word is used, and they can figure out whether the usage is similar across the multiple appearances of that word, or whether there are slight differences that can also be discussed. But having a basis in the text for the usage that you're going to be focusing on can help students make more sense of the text as well as that new word. The second tip emphasized here is to clarify and reinforce definitions. So once we give students these usable, digestible, graspable definitions that are anchored in the text, then we want to clarify and reinforce them using 3 categories of approaches: examples, non-examples, and concrete representations. So if you look at this word map on the right, we have the target word enormous, and then reading from top to bottom, a simple definition that's certainly digestible by students. Then beneath that, we have synonyms and antonyms. So words that have a similar meaning on the left-hand side, words that have a contrasting meaning on the right-hand side. And then at the bottom, maybe less commonly used than synonyms and antonyms, are examples and non-examples. So things that would fall into the category of enormous objects are dinosaurs, skyscrapers, and cruise ships, and non-examples might include ants, babies, and flies. Now this is interesting here because these are examples of things that are either enormous or not, but it can get more complex as you move to more abstract words and different kinds of categories. Examples that you provide here can span content areas too, so we can think about the word area that we discussed in the last module being differently used in math and in science, and then even across other subject areas like geography. And students can brainstorm together how those different usages might relate differently to one another. And graphic organizers like this one that you see on the right can certainly be helpful for students to see the relationships among the words that they know and then the words that they're coming to master. Where possible, you should use these kinds of visual depictions to convey concrete representations of target words. So we showed that word map before that included a lot of terms that students would already be familiar with, but if our focus is on words that are newer than that, then what we're able to do when it's possible is to depict those target words with a striking visual exemplar of the meaning. So impact has this beautiful picture of somebody punching into a tank of water. Bombard, in the sort of metaphorical usage that is being conveyed here, is depicted as well. And then transmit. It's not as if pictures are definitions, but they're enough to get a conversation started and to help students sort of map and have a quick recognition of these new words that we're hoping that they're going to master. And then it's also helpful when we do these kinds of presentations, as we discussed in the prior module, to draw attention to any cognates that exist for those target words, because offering that one-to-one translation can sometimes, again, help clue students in to things that they already know but didn't realize that they had some words for. These kinds of word cards generally can help ground new word learning in easy to recognize and also easy to recall formats. So in line with the idea of word cards, we also have the manipulative or the scaffold of glossaries. And in glossaries, we collect words. That's something that we're accustomed to doing. But for ELs and content classes, glossaries can be both a quick reference for reminders about word meanings and a place to enrich and extend understanding and application of new words. So in this glossary here, there are a number of rows including different activities and then the columns corresponding to each of the target words. And the glossary features could include things like definitions in a student-friendly format like we've been discussing, synonyms and antonyms, meaning webs, sample sentences, also things like conversational exercises to get students started in thinking about talking with their classmates with these new words, multimodal exercises, so we've been talking about the sort of oral language versus written language, modalities, but you can even extend into other modalities like drawing and visual modalities that can help students work on and work with these new words. And then you can also include in glossaries translations, whether those are translations into cognates, that is, words that sound similar in the home language and in English and also mean the same thing, or translations that are spelled out in more detail in the home language just to give students a really quick reference of what this new target word means. So our third tip today is to elicit evidence of understanding. We've talked about different ways that we can help students see the meanings of these new words and start to practice them. But what else we need to do is concern ourselves with assessing whether students are making sense of the new words, mastering them, and are able to use them flexibly across contexts. So this tips recommends that we provide opportunities for students to respond to questions where they show their understanding of subtle differences in usage and meaning. This involves generating open-ended questions on the part of the teacher and inviting discussion about new words to explore what might be incomplete or mistaken understandings. And what we can do here is acknowledge and explore words that have multiple meanings through simple but what can be really illuminating exercises. As you see on the right-hand side here, there are two plausible student-friendly definitions for the word exhibit, and this comes directly from the practice guide. The first one says, "The exhibit we saw at the zoo really helped us understand how animals play together." The second definition, which again is a student-friendly sentence that demonstrates the meaning of this word. The sentence reads, "After coming back from our trip to the zoo, some of us exhibited anger and sadness at the way that animals were being treated." So then the follow-up question to these two potential definitions is simply, which definition goes with each sentence? Explain why. And so we have exhibit as a verb and exhibit as a noun, each of which has its own meanings and implications, and understanding that students have grasped that difference and how they can apply this word as a verb or as a noun depending on a context and what it might mean for them and how they could use it can help us make sure that the students are grasping the very understanding that we hope that they will. The next tip recommends facilitating structured discussions to increase opportunities for students to use academic words. So here the focus is less on sort of formative assessment and more on giving students an authentic context in which to apply their new word knowledge. So one version of this is to invite conversations about issues that are raised by the topic that your lessons are revolving around, or even the target text itself that don't have a right or wrong answer. So questions about whether, for example, school uniforms should be required, or the sorts of things that should be done in order to take care of the environment. And in these kinds of contexts, students can develop their own opinions and practice their argumentation skills while they're using target vocabulary words. So a word like environment might not come naturally to discussion of a fourth grader, but if they're talking about whether recycling should be mandatory, it makes sense that they would bring that word to bear in their discussions with their peers. On the other hand, students can also recount personal experiences that are related to the words. So we can ask them to describe an exhibit that they visited, either to the class or in pairs or small groups, and give those words an embedding in the social practices that they're carrying out and building with their peers. Again, we want students to learn these target words because they are high leverage in academic discourse. And academic discourse is something that they build and develop with their classmates just as they do with you and through the text that they encounter in their classes. So the fifth tip pushes us into a different modality. We're moving from the oral modality into the written modality. So this recommendation says to require students to use the target academic words in their writing activities. These activities should vary in length and specificity and also vary in open-endedness. And you could consider asking students to write brief reflections on target texts, or following parent shares, they could also reflect to practice their use of their new target words. And I want to just draw a little bit of attention to this variation in writing activities, because oftentimes we think about writing in the context of teaching vocabulary just as either filling in blanks or writing a definition, or maybe writing a long text, a 5-paragraph essay that includes those target words. But the activities can vary even more than that in length and level of formality and even degree of sociality. So we could have students do 3 different activities just focusing on the words from the text that we've been discussing here. So for instance, you could ask students to write about which exhibit their favorite was the last time that they visited the zoo and why. You can also have them write a letter to a pen pal, a hypothetical one or even a real one, about the enormous snowman you made with your family. And you can have a more social, sort of dialogical writing activity too, kind of like a reader's theater, where students can write and then act out a scene with a partner or with classmates to teach others about one way to protect the environment. So these are just a sampling of possible activities that you can help students use to practice their new vocabulary words in, again, authentic literacy contexts. And finally, the 6th tip here is to engage students in activities that will increase their exposure to and experiences with the word. So students can do things like use the words in fun activities like charades and sketching and drawing, which can help increase their comfort with new vocabulary. And then they can have these experiences with words that you foster for them and with them in writing and speech and reading. So you saw these activities about how to develop awareness of and flexible use of cognates that have different characteristics, and these are just the sorts of things that certain students might really latch onto and think are fun games and activities that they can spend some time kind of mucking around in words with. And there are lots of different ways you can do this, but the real key is to get students engaged in playing around with words and seeing their different affordances and just using them as a part of their academic interactions so that they feel comfortable with them and it becomes second nature to use them when it makes sense to do so. So before we close, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, sort of focusing at this high level on the 2 different approaches to teaching vocabulary. So here we focused on direct instruction, which basically means that teachers lead interactions with students to acquaint them with new vocabulary, helping them practice saying and reading and spelling unfamiliar words. And this is in contrast to the topic of our 3rd module, word learning strategies, where teachers support students in engaging in self-directed activities to increase their familiarity with, exposure to, and depth of understanding of new vocabulary. So with that sort of contrast in mind, the takeaways from this module include the basic acknowledgement that we all know you're familiar with, but it bears repeating. English learner students benefit from effective word teaching techniques that are applicable to the whole class. And recruiting students' home languages, especially cognates and also translation equivalents, frames their emerging bilingualism as a resource. And especially in the context of this direct instruction, introducing and having students practice using words in multiple modalities fosters flexibility and confidence so they can master vocabulary and content at the same time. As before, for more information, you can check out the key resource that this presentation draws on, the 2014 What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide on ELs. Parts 1 and 3 of this 3-part tutorial, which are accessible on our collaboration website, and then in general we have other resources that are also available on that website that can support your collaborative activities as well as your specific orientation toward teaching vocabulary to support your EL students' English language development and their content mastery as well. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in this partnership.